Hello and welcome to Salute. I'm your host, Bob Peters, and my guest today is a chaplain who served in all branches, really.
Yes.
Bob Haines. I met you at the Q, 1410, the radio station, right. You and Keith Oliver, and I was very impressed with what you've done over the years. And so I'd like the people to get to know you a little bit better. Where are you originally from?
Okay, originally from Altoona, Florida. Altoona is just a little bit north of Umatilla, which is a little bit north of Eustis. Southern edge of the Ocala National Forest. My grandparents and their parents moved down in the early 20th century, around 1930s, worked with citrus and so forth and so on. And so my mother was born in Altoona, and spent the first about 11 years of my life there before moving up to the Gainesville area. Born in Waterman Hospital, Eustis, delivered by a doctor who delivered a great many babies in Lake County over the years, back in the early 1950s and 60s. Mother worked at Waterman, so I used to go down there as a kid and play around the hospital. So Eustis, Umatilla, Altoona, they're all kind of home for me.
And you got into preaching, you're a Southern Baptist,
right?
Correct?
Southern Baptist, raised in Southern Baptist Church, yeah.
And according to this bio, I've been looking at your bio, it's very impressive. You started at 16?
My first sermon actually was preached at age 15 for Youth Sunday up in Waldo, Florida, which is near Gainesville. We had moved up to the Gainesville area, and I was active in the First Baptist Church of Waldo. We had a Youth Sunday, and so they invited me to be the preacher, which I had about a 20-minute sermon that lasted about 3 minutes. And yeah, started preaching then, and after that began to preach in local churches. I had several friends, older friends who were pastors, and you know, back in those days, you could be in the Southern Baptist faith and tradition. You could be licensed to preach at an early age and practice before seminary and so forth and so on. So I started preaching around about the age of 16, different local churches.
Wow. And you joined, we're getting into the military part of it, you joined the Air Force. Your family, correct me if I'm wrong, was Air Force?
Right. My father was in World War II. He was in the Army Air Force, which came out of the Army Air Corps, still under the Army, but the Air Force arm. And he enlisted, I'm not sure the exact year, 1942, 43. Served in Gainesville, the Alachua Airfield, met my mother, who was up at the university at the time visiting, and got married, and then finished the war in the South Pacific 7th Air Force, which, by the way, I was also in the 7th Air Force in Vietnam. So my dad was in the Army Air Force. Really the only thing I knew, he had died younger, actually when I was 15, so I received some of his stuff that he had during the war. Had some ribbons and medals and things of that nature. So I was kind of in all of the Air Force, and I was also, as a youngster in Waldo, we had what was then termed the Ground Observer Corps, which was an offshoot of the old beach front towers that, if you study history, where they watched for aircraft on the coast.
During World War II they did a lot.
World War II, where we had the Ground Observer Corps, and we had a tower in Waldo where I lived as a teenager, and several of us young boys, preteens and teens, as kind of as a hobby or as a Boy Scout type activity, we manned that tower and watched for the planes, and our the guy who ran it was a retired military, and he would take us down to MacDill Air Force Base and various things. I visited the radar installation, so I would kind of like the Air Force, and I could tell you the story of how I wound up in the Air Force if you wanted to.
Sure show.
But yeah, I'd graduated from high school. As I said earlier, my father had already died, and my mother was raising myself and my brother and sister and I. So after high school in the summer, I had a couple of jobs. I worked as an electrician, worked at a local gas station, pumping gas and so forth. Really had no aims or ambitions, no goals in life. And so we had a little basketball court, and us boys, ranging from the age of 12 or 13 to even up in 20s and so forth, would gather at the basketball court, shoot hoops, and choose up sides to play basketball at night. We had lights. And so I was up there one night. It was in October during the Cuban Missile Crisis had just started. And this friend of mine came driving up in his car, and another friend said, "Hey, here comes this Air Force guy." His name was Bob also. So
great name.
Great name. And so Bob came up and said, "Hey, I understand you're going to Air Force." "Yeah, I'm going to take my physical in the morning." And in the meantime, for whatever reason, I had gone to the recruiter and had taken my ASVAB test and various testings, and they had my records. So it was about 8:30 at night, and I said, "You mind if I go with you?" He said, "No, I don't mind at all." So I went home. My mother calls the Air Force recruiter and says, "Hey, my son would like to come over if possible and get his information. He wants to go take his physical." So at 10 o'clock at night, I'm in the recruiter's office getting all my paperwork together. Staff Sergeant Knight was his name. I'll never forget the guy. And the next morning, Bob and I drove to Jacksonville. We took our physical, and a week later, October 24th, 1962, we were on a plane to San Antonio. And I spent 5 weeks there and then left for Keesler Air Force Base. He stayed for 8 weeks, and I had not seen him since until a couple of years ago. Went by to see Bob. But, that's how I wound up in the Air Force.
Now, when you first went into the Air Force, you weren't doing the ministry.
No.
So you were
had no idea I'd ever be full-time minister.
Yeah.
Did some lay work, but not ministry. No.
Okay. You according to this, you were intelligence specialist.
Sure. Yeah.
Really?
We have an organization that from 1948 to about 1979 called the United States Air Force Security Service, which was basically the intelligence arm of the Air Force, worked directly for NSA. And so I went to school at Keesler Air Force Base, which, by the way, I just returned from a visit last week, and was trained as electronic intelligence or electronic intercept work, which be honest with you, I can't go into detail because a lot of classified information that we still, even though it's been 55, 60 years ago, we still don't talk about too much. But we trained in with basically electronic equipment, intelligence type work, and served for about 7.5 years, and a couple overseas assignments. Basically, most of our places were overseas. I'll just say this: we had the Soviet Union surrounded.
Yeah. Well, I see in the bio you were all over the place.
Sure.
Just to mention a few: Pakistan, Italy, Vietnam, and some statesides.
Yeah,
too.
served in Peshawar, Pakistan for 15 months. I was actually, after school, I was in San Antonio at Kelly Air Force Base, which was our headquarters, and we were there about 8 months doing some schooling, and finally we all began to get orders, and I got orders for 6937th Communication Group, which is this symbol here. Got orders for 6937th Group, Peshawar, Pakistan. I said, well, where in the world's Pakistan? Never a 19-year-old kid, where's Pakistan? So we had to look it up on a map and so forth and so on. So I went over there and kind of changed my life and perspective on the world, because you see a part of, like the younger guys today going to Iraq and Afghanistan, places like this, different scenario. I mean, they're in a combat zone. We were in a peacetime organization, but spent 15 months in Peshawar, outside of Peshawar, Pakistan, doing intelligence work. Worked around the clock. We worked what we call rotating shifts. Worked 3 swings, which was from 3 in the afternoon to 11 in the evening. And we were off 24 hours. We worked 3 mids from 11 to 6, 7 in the morning. Then we were off 24 hours. We had to switch to days for 3 days. Then we, thank the good Lord, got 2 days off to rest and relax and do that over again. We did that for 15 months without any leave, without any time off. We would travel up to the Khyber Pass, to the Indus River, various areas in Pakistan, see the sights. And, we had some Pakistani Air Force persons who worked with us, so I got to know some Pakistanis.
Yeah.
That's where I was introduced to different faith groups other than Southern Baptist Christian tradition. Learned to appreciate where other people were coming from, the way they grew up, and their religious tradition, and we interchanged our faiths. It's quite an interesting experience.
You hear that a lot from veterans,
Sure.
They get exposed to different countries and different traditions, and it really, you grow. You grow with that.
You grow.
But Vietnam, how long were you in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam a year, Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Again, intelligence type work, assigned to the headquarters 7th Air Force, which kind of made me proud because my dad ended World War II with 7th Air Force. And basically my job there was to help identify the locations of all the SAM sites, surface to air missile sites, all the AAA sites. Mm-hmm. So we had a map of all the ones we could identify where they were in the DMZ in North Vietnam, and I spent basically a year doing that.
In 1968, there was a turning point in your life.
Sure.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. 1968 was a pivotal year. By the way, I missed all the hippie stuff of the 60s. I was overseas all the time, so I missed a lot of that. I just wanted to throw that in. 68 was a pivotal year for me. I had found out that my best friend in high school, who was actually 2 years younger than me, he had graduated and joined the Marine Corps. A fellow by the name of Marcus Jones. We called him Granny because when Marcus would be around with us, we always had to tell him to come on. He couldn't keep up, but in his senior year in high school, he was one of the top high and low hurdlers in the state of Florida, as well as majored in football, super athlete.
Yeah.
But I had heard from my brother. I'd come back from overseas and said, let's go visit Marcus. I always wanted to visit Marcus, and he said, well, haven't you heard? And I said, well, no, really, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, Marcus was killed in Vietnam. Come to find out, he had joined the Marines, had been off the coast of Vietnam, had volunteered for a mission, and was killed. So that obviously had a big impact. But there were several things. I had attended a local church. I was stationed back at Kelly Air Force Base, and there was a little Baptist church called Lackland Baptist Church on the other side of Lackland Air Force Base, civilian church obviously, but I'd involved myself in that church, had met a friend of mine who was very involved in a program called the Navigators, which was a interdenominational Christian evangelism type group, and we had sponsored a pavilion at the Hemisphere, which was a kind of miniature World's Fair in which we showed religious films and Billy Graham films and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I had made friends with him, and I'd worked in this pavilion and showing those films and doing evangelistic type work. In the meantime, another person that impacted my life at the very same time was a guy by the name of Bill Cates. I had gone to work. We worked in a little office, kind of like this little room, and there was a back room, and I had gone in the room and opened the door, and I had heard this kind of loud, boisterous talking in the back room, and all of a sudden I heard this guy says, well, I always try to stay in touch with the Almighty. Is this Jesus back there? What's going on, So anyway, make a long story short, Bill had been a songwriter. He had graduated from a college in Nashville, Tennessee, and he wrote music. And at the time, he had been a songwriter for the Up With People group, the sing-out group that was very popular back in the 60s. And they had 3 major casts, and they traveled all over the world and had planned on going into communist countries. Well, Bill had been in the same intelligence school that I had gone to only years later, and he had to sign a document in order to allow him to have the top secret security clearance. And he knew that when he got out of the Air Force, they would travel to communist countries and so forth. So he didn't want to sign the paperwork.
Yeah, he was afraid they'd find out.
Afraid they'd find out or whatever. So anyway, I met Bill. Bill and I became very close friends. He was also Southern Baptist from Belmont, Texas. And he had written a very popular song at the time in Baptist circles and other Christian circles called "Do You Really Care?" So Bill and I teamed up. He had joined the Air Force. He did not have a car, but his fiance, who was traveling with one of the Up With People cast throughout Texas, Bill wanted obviously to see her on weekends, so he and I would get in my car and we would drive around. So Bill and I palled around together, and he was a very spiritual person. Just, it's hard to explain, unlike any other person I'd ever seen with purpose. And so between Bill, between my other friend, between my friend dying in Vietnam and going to this church, at that point I decided I was going to go into full-time ministry with the goal of becoming a chaplain if possible.
Yeah, because you were not a chaplain in the Air Force.
Not a chaplain in the Air
But
Force.
then you got out.
Right.
And after that, it was Lake Sumter Community
Went to Lake
College.
Sumter, wonderful place, good people.
And also...
Met my wife there at Lake Sumter, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's kind of life-changing too,
It is, I know. Yeah. Stetson University?
Stetson.
You went there and for religion and philosophy, right?
I was, well, actually at Stetson I majored in religious studies. The problem that I had with Stetson, I don't have a problem with Stetson. My dad went to Stetson. I have a lot of friends who graduated from Stetson. Great, wonderful school, but it was a private school, and they took some hours away from me that I had to earn in Lake Sumter. And I was 28 years old at the time, and it's kind of humorous in a way. Lake Sumter had given me 2 credit hours. All state colleges at that time gave you 2 hours of being in the military, and you were exempted from taking physical education. I was way out of shape, and Stetson wanted me to take a semester of physical education and get my 2 hours back, plus I lost some other hours. So I majored in religious studies and had some super professors, a couple of which I remained friends with for years. And then I transferred to the University of Florida to pick those hours back up because I was getting older and I want to move on with my life.
Yeah, this show is a half an hour, and
I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great. But I want to make sure we get as much of this in as possible, because then we're talking Army, right?
Well, I went to the University of Florida, graduated from the University of Florida with philosophy, and then I stayed another semester in religion, so I got 2 bachelor's degrees, and I went to seminary up in Louisville, Kentucky. And during my second year at seminary, the services had a chaplain candidate program where you could be commissioned and go to the chaplain school. So I wrote the endorsing agency of the Southern Baptist Convention, which at that time was a home mission board, to the chaplain's commission. I said, I'm in my second year, I want to be commissioned and get into the chaplain corps, and I obviously want to go in the Air Force. And I got a nice letter back. He said, well, Bob, I said, I hate to tell you this, but we got a lot of guys going in the Air Force. We got a big waiting list in the Air Force, but if you want to be a reserve chaplain, you can go in the Army. So I wrote back and said, that's fine. He endorsed me to the Army. I had a pastor friend at a local church in Louisville, Kentucky, who was a reservist major. He swore me in. I became a second lieutenant in the Army Reserve, went to chaplain school at Fort Wadsworth, New York. Did training down at Fort Knox, and then when I graduated from seminary, became pastor of First Baptist Church in Palm Coast, and became a staff chaplain in Gainesville at 301st Field Hospital. So I served 4 years in the Army Reserve, winding up as a first lieutenant. Very enjoyable. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, I had a gentleman on my show, and you know him, Stan Beach, Chaplain Stan Beach.
Yes.
Highly
super guy,
a Vietnam veteran, was severely wounded over there.
Yes.
And one of the chaplain churches is named after him, one of the
chaplain school.
Yes. Chaplain school. So when I think of him and I think of you, and I remember one thing he told me is that a chaplain will wear whatever uniform.
You're
right?
a chaplain. That's right.
If they say you're Army today, you're Army today. If you're Navy and MR, you're Navy.
Yep.
But you also did with the Navy.
Then the Navy, I wound up in the Navy. Same kind of story. I was had graduated from Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. We came down to Palm Coast, where I served as the first full-time pastor at the First Baptist Church of Palm Coast, and did mission work and led that church into full-time Southern Baptist Church and constituted that church and so forth. After 2 years, which we were required to serve 2 years in the ministry before being endorsed active duty. So I did my 2 years, and I always had this goal in mind to be a chaplain. So again, wrote the Home Mission Board. I said, I've done my 2 years, been in the Army Reserve Chaplain Corps, the Army Reserve chaplaincy for 2 years. However, my heart is with the Air Force. I served for 8 years, and I really wanted to be an Air Force chaplain. I got a nice letter back. He says, Bob, he said, I hate to tell you this again. He said, we got about 3 guys going in the Air Force. We have about 30 in the wings want to go. It's going to be a good 10 years. And I told him, however, I'll take the Army. I'm already in the Army Reserves. He said, we got about 4 or 5 guys we put in the Army. This is post-Vietnam. We got 4 or 5 guys we put in the Army. We got about 25 or 30 waiting in the rings. However, if you want to be a chaplain full-time, he said the Navy's open. Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, was increasing the Navy, increasing the ship force. They were increasing the Navy chaplain number. And so go down and see the Navy recruiter and make your application. And they did an interview with me by a current Navy chaplain who was a chaplain at the time, and everything was fine. They, I guess, considered me fit to be a Navy chaplain. And so a week later, I was in Newport, Rhode Island in chaplain school. Had to rush, we had to pack up and had to get up there, and went through chaplain school in Newport. So kind of how I wound up in those 3 legitimate branches of service, the Air Force, Army, and the Navy. And then, as many people know, Navy chaplains, like Navy lawyers and doctors and corpsmen, also serve with the Marine Corps. So I served, I think, 4 different Marine Corps units while I was as a Navy chaplain, and wound up wearing every uniform. Yeah, except for the Coast Guard.
With the Marines, you were with the you were in Japan, and you were also with the 2nd Marine Division in Desert Storm, correct?
Sure. I served with the 8th Engineer Support Battalion at Camp Lejeune First for almost 2 years. Then I went on a float, or deployment as we call it, with the 2nd Marine Division's 26th Marine Amphibious Unit, where you do the amphibious assaults and practicing and so forth in the Mediterranean Sea. And then my 3rd assignment with the Marines was with Marine Aircraft Group 36 under the 1st Marine Air Wing in Okinawa. And then while I was in Okinawa, Desert Shield broke out. During the Desert Shield phase, they discovered they were about 10 chaplains short for Desert Shield. And so 4 of my colleagues, myself, 5 chaplains and assistants, hitchhiked, bummed rides off of aircraft to get to Desert Storm, and I wound up with the 2nd Marine Division, 2nd Light Armored Infantry Battalion, out in the front areas, doing excursions in Iraq and various places, actually prior to the ground assault. So I was right out in the front. Many times didn't know where I was at. And we did at least one. I've done up to 4 or 5 worship services a day in the desert. My assistant and I, we had a Humvee, and we just found out where a company was, and we would go out and
a lot of people are under the misconception that a chaplain just has a little church there, and then you hold a service there. But you guys do get out. I've had interviewed several chaplains. I'm running out of time a little bit. So you got out of the Marine Corps. Give us a little, where is Bob now?
Well, I got out of the chaplain corps, out of the Navy, retired, and pastored a couple of small churches. In fact, I pastored Central Baptist Church right here in Leesburg, just across from the Methodist Church. I pastored out at Cassia Baptist Church out in Cassia, Florida. Pastored a little church over in DeLand, Northside Baptist Church, with 3 churches. But to be honest with you, I was a Navy chaplain. I'm used to working with commanding officers, and the pastorate just wasn't quite my calling, I guess, so to speak. And so somehow I wound up teaching school at Hampton DeBose Academy and Legacy High School down in Zellwood, which was a private Christian school. So I was able to impact and share my life and of course, teaching the classes to the young students there. About 12 or 13 years later, or 12, 13 years ago, we moved up to the Ocala National Forest and quit teaching and retired. And, been riding a Harley Davidson motorcycle for
yeah, you pulled up on it today, yeah.
So decided, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get on Facebook and I'm going to create some Facebook pages and groups, and I'm going to try to bring old friends. And I started riding my Harley all over the country.
So Facebook, and you also wrote a couple books, because we're running out of time, but tell us a little bit about the books. And if anybody wants to get to know you a little bit better, what do they do? Facebook?
Sure.
What do you...
Facebook page me. I'm on a motorcycle. I kind of look like I look here, but you can find me on Facebook. I do a lot of military and school reunion groups and getting people together. I did write 3 books. I have 2 here, Love and Joy and Other Principles. The other one's called Peace. The books themselves are out of print, but you can get the Kindle version off of Amazon. And if you do a Google search, you can find used books. Anybody that wants to get me know me a little better, understand my theology and the way I operate, kind of independent.
Well, I, sir, want to thank you for all you've done in the military for our country and for our brothers and sisters in the service, as well as everybody. I only have one question.
Sure.
What happened to the Coast Guard?
Coast Guard.
Don't tell me you were in the Coast Guard, too.
Very interesting. We did have chaplains serve with the Coast Guard. I never had the opportunity, but I have some children. I got a younger daughter who's kind of interesting person herself. My family's kind of like me, so they're kind of interesting. My youngest daughter, 5 years ago, decided we need to make up for that, and she joined the Coast Guard Reserve.
Okay, so we got it all covered.
I get
now
to go to Coast Guard bases and eat good chow.
We got it all covered. I want to thank you for coming on the show,
Bob.
sir. Thank you
My pleasure. Appreciate it.
For your service, and you can find in the Daily Commercial the Chap's Corner. You write every Saturday on the Salute page.
Yes.
So let's say goodbye. I want you to join me. To all our veterans out there, our active military and their families, we salute you for all you do. Till next time.